10,000 years ago, on the shores of a lake in what is now Kenya, something terrible happened. Archaeologists found the remains of 27 people, men, women, children, all killed in what looks like a coordinated, deliberate attack. Skulls caved in, hands bound. One woman, heavily pregnant, face down in the mud. Nobody buried them. Nobody came back for them. This site is called Nataruk, and it's one of the oldest pieces of hard evidence we have for organized human warfare. Not a hunt gone wrong, not an accident, a planned, systematic attack on an entire group of people. But here's what's strange. When researchers started asking why it happened, what actually pushed one group of humans to systematically wipe out another, the answers weren't what anyone expected. They weren't grand. They weren't political. They weren't ideological. Some of them were almost embarrassingly small. Some of them were things you'd recognize from your own life. So today, we're going to talk about why ancient humans really went to war, not the textbook version, the real version. And some of these reasons are going to surprise you. Before we get into it, let's set the scene. No armies, no generals, no nations, no flags. Ancient humans lived in tribes, small bands of 20 to 150 people moving constantly across the landscape, hunting, gathering, surviving. These groups weren't isolated. They knew each other existed, they traded sometimes, they intermarried sometimes, and sometimes they killed each other. The question is, what caused it? What turned neighboring tribes, groups who might have coexisted for generations, into enemies? The triggers are weirder, more petty, and more human than you'd think. Let's go through them one by one. The most obvious trigger is also the most brutal, not having enough. Imagine your tribe is having a bad season. The animals migrated earlier than expected. The river you've relied on for 2 generations is running low. The berry patches your grandparents knew are gone. Your food stores are nearly empty. You have children. You have elders. You have people depending on you. And 20 kilometers away, another group is camped near a valley with fruit trees, clean water, and plenty of game. At what point does desperation become a decision? For ancient humans, that point came faster than we might like to admit. Resources weren't comfort, they were survival. And the calculation wasn't moral, it was mathematical. Your group needs food. That group has food. You outnumber them. Or you have the element of surprise. The raid isn't cruelty, it's arithmetic. But here's the part that surprises people. Scarcity didn't just cause one-off raids. It caused wars. Because the group you raided didn't disappear, they remembered. And when they recovered, when they had the numbers and the nerve, they came back. Scarcity created a first strike, and that first strike planted the seed of a conflict that could outlast the original drought by decades. The archaeological record is remarkably consistent on this. Across the American Southwest and prehistoric Europe, across sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific Islands, periods of climate stress align almost perfectly with spikes in skeletal trauma and mass graves. The rain stopped, the harvests failed, and people, predictably, turned on each other. One study of prehistoric California found that during periods of prolonged drought, rates of violent death increased by as much as 300%. 3 times as many people killed during hard times as during good ones. Not because ancient humans were uniquely savage, because they were human, and they were desperate, and desperate people make desperate choices. Scarcity is the engine. Everything else is fuel. Here's the trigger nobody wants to talk about. But the evidence keeps pointing to it. So we're going to talk about it. Across dozens of ancient conflict sites, researchers have noticed a consistent and disturbing pattern in the skeletal remains. When victims are identified by sex, it's overwhelmingly men who were killed on the spot. Executed, clubbed, left where they fell. Women, particularly younger women of reproductive age, are often missing from the death counts entirely. They weren't absent because they escaped. They were taken. Raiding for mates is one of the oldest and most well-documented drivers of intergroup violence in human history. It shows up in the bones. It shows up in ancient DNA studies, where researchers can track sudden influxes of female lineages into a population with no corresponding male lineages. The genetic signature of women absorbed into a group that killed the men they came with. It shows up in the anthropological record of nearly every pre-state society ever studied. Groups that successfully raided rivals didn't just take food and territory. They took women, and they incorporated them into the group, sometimes by force, sometimes over time, through something closer to adoption. This is uncomfortable to say plainly. But here's why it happened and why it was so persistent. In a world without agriculture, without cities, without any of the social safety nets we built later, Reproductive success was survival. A group that grew had more hunters, more defenders, more children to carry knowledge forward. A group that shrank over generations eventually disappeared. More women of childbearing age meant more children. More children meant a stronger tribe. It was brutal, but from the inside of ancient logic, it made complete sense. Some researchers argue that the drive to acquire mates from outside the group wasn't just a side effect of war. It was one of the primary reasons war existed at all. That raiding for women was, for hundreds of thousands of years, essentially standard operating procedure between rival groups, not an atrocity by the standards of the time. A strategy. What makes this even stranger is that it may have had unintended genetic benefits. Groups that consistently brought in women from other tribes were also bringing in genetic diversity, reducing the risks of inbreeding that would otherwise devastate a small, isolated population. War was horrific, but it was also, in the most uncomfortable way possible, part of what kept early human populations genetically healthy. That doesn't make it right. It just makes it real. Now here's where it gets almost absurd, because not all ancient wars started from desperation or strategic need. Some of them started from a stolen pig. Ethnographic studies of tribal societies, groups living today in ways that closely mirror how ancient humans lived, show the same pattern over and over again. A huge percentage of organized violence between groups starts not from existential crisis, but from a specific personal insult, a theft, a trespass, a killing that hasn't been answered yet. One group's hunter strays too far and takes an animal from land the neighboring tribe considers theirs. A young man from one village insults a man from another at a trading gathering. Someone's brother gets killed in a scuffle over a water source that both groups have used for years. Small things, specific things, the kind of things that in a modern city you might settle with a strongly worded conversation, or, at worst, a lawsuit. In the ancient world, they settled them with raids. And then the revenge cycle started. The offended group retaliated, the other group retaliated back. Within a generation, both sides had accumulated so many dead to avenge that nobody could even clearly remember what the original offense was. The feud had become its own justification. The war had become its own reason for continuing. Researchers who study these cycles describe them as almost self-sealing. Each act of violence creates the moral permission for the next one. And because both sides are retaliating, both sides are always retaliating, from their own perspective, neither side ever sees itself as the aggressor. They are always responding to what the other side did first, even when the other side is saying exactly the same thing. There's something almost darkly comic about it. Two groups, locked in a war that's been going on for 40 years, each utterly convinced that they are the wronged party. Each killing justified by the last killing. Each raid answering a raid that was answering a raid that was answering an insult that neither side's grandchildren can fully explain anymore. This pattern, the revenge cycle that outlives its original cause, may be the single most consistent feature of ancient warfare across all cultures and all continents. Not scarcity, not mate raiding, just the human inability to let something go unanswered. Ancient humans didn't just go to war because they had to. Sometimes they went to war because they felt they owed it to someone who was already dead. Scarcity, mates, and revenge explain most of ancient warfare. But researchers have identified a few more triggers that don't fit neatly into the survival story, and these are the ones that tend to catch people off guard. The first is prestige. In many ancient societies, war wasn't just conflict, it was a credentialing system. A young man couldn't be considered a full adult until he had participated in a successful raid. He couldn't marry, he couldn't hold influence in the group. He couldn't be taken seriously in councils or decision-making. The raid was the rite of passage, the proof of manhood. And so groups went to war, at least in part, because their young men needed the war in order to become men. Violence as a social institution, conflict as a career ladder. The second surprise is territory, but not in the way you'd expect. Ancient humans didn't have maps. They didn't have written treaties or GPS coordinates, but they absolutely had a detailed, precise sense of where their land ended and someone else's began. These boundaries were invisible to outsiders, communicated entirely through oral tradition, marked by landmarks, seasonal patterns, and generations of memory. Cross one, even accidentally, and it could be read as a deliberate act of aggression. Wars started over borders that existed only in the minds of the people who defended them. The most surprising trigger of all might be ritual. In some ancient societies, conflict wasn't primarily about material gain at all. It was ceremonial. Raids were conducted on a roughly seasonal schedule, almost like a recurring calendar event. The goal wasn't to destroy the enemy or take their territory, it was to capture specific individuals, to take particular trophies, to perform acts that carried deep spiritual meaning within the culture. Violence as religion, war as sacred obligation. When you stack all of these together, prestige raids, invisible borders, ceremonial warfare, the picture of ancient conflict becomes much stranger and much richer than the simple survival story we usually tell. Ancient humans didn't only go to war because they were hungry or desperate or wronged. Sometimes they went to war because their culture told them it was the honorable thing to do, the necessary thing, the right thing, which, if you think about it, is not so different from how war gets justified today. None of these triggers disappeared. We just gave them new names. Scarcity is now economic competition and resource policy. Revenge cycles are now generational conflicts between nations that have been retaliating against each other for so long that the original cause is buried under centuries of grievance. Prestige raids are now military posturing between powers that need to demonstrate strength. Ritual warfare is now nationalism. Conflict performed as much for the audience at home as for any strategic goal. The weapons changed, the scale changed. The justifications got more elaborate. The wiring underneath stayed exactly the same. Ancient humans went to war for reasons that are uncomfortable, surprisingly petty, and deeply familiar, all at once. Hunger, women, a debt that needed paying, a young man with something to prove, a boundary no one else could see. It wasn't grand, it was human. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real version, not the cleaned up one, subscribe. New video coming soon.